Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome John Cochrane, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, who blogs under the moniker The Grumpy Economist. John, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
John, I asked you on to talk about a paper you wrote earlier this year titled The Rule of Law in the Regulatory State. My hope is that we can do this without either getting too wonky or wading too deeply into ideological fever swamps. Frame the issue for us. What are you sounding the alarm about?
Well, thank you. I don't think it is ideological, actually. So we live now more and more under not law, but under regulation. And most of your audience will probably think of regulation as there's a rule book, abide by the rule book, and you're okay. But that's not really the way it's going these days. The regulators sort of have power to tell you what to do pretty much as they make it up. And that power is so great, they now can force you to do things you don't want to do. And my big worry, that leads to a loss of political freedom. If you're a banker, you don't dare speak out against the Fed, even if you're following all the rules as you know them. If you're an insurance company, you don't dare speak out against Obamacare or the ACA if you don't like it. They can come ruin your business, even if you're abiding by all the rules as you know them. So that's a big danger. It's, of course, an economic danger. I think that's behind a lot of the slowness of our economy. But that's a looming political danger. Your right to speak out is in danger.
You know, you've likened regulatory agencies to barons within monarchies. And you noted that our partisan political system has discovered how to harness the power of these agencies to enforce political support. Give us some specific examples.
Yeah, now the barons, let me back up to the barons and monarchies. Your first worry is that the government is used for partisan political support. Lois Lerner at the IRS was going after Republicans. And for the moment, that isn't the number one issue. The number one issue is that the regulatory agencies are powers unto themselves. So the first rule is don't speak out against the agency, and not quite yet don't speak out against the party in power. And anybody knows, if you want a zoning permit, don't speak out against the local zoning board. And the same thing applies to banks, to insurance companies, to the Environmental Protection Agency, certainly to the Food and Drug Administration. If you're a company that you need them to approve your latest medical device, you better not complain too loudly about how they're handling things right now.
Well, I have a lot of friends in that business, and they tell private horror stories about dealing with the FDA. I can't get one of them to come on the air and tell their story publicly.
Right, nor will they write op-eds, write their congressman, or defend themselves in court. I talked to one recently who had just a horrible story. He had a medical device that fulfilled all the rules, and for political, ideological reasons, they turned it down. And I said, well, go to court. You're fine on the issue. He said, yeah, but I've got 9 other ones that they're about to rule on, and if I force them to obey the rules on this one, they'll turn down the 9 other ones, and my business goes under. That's a good example of the rule of law is missing here. You're fine on the rules, yet you don't dare exercise your rights.
Well, what checks and balances are in place to make sure that all citizens and corporations are treated equally at the hands of our regulatory agencies?
Well, not enough. And I think that's the point. My essay is, to some extent, asking this question more than giving the answers, because I'm an economist, not a lawyer. But over the last 1,000 years, we've developed a lot of checks and balances against government power in the legal system. You have the right to know the evidence being used against you. You have the right to question witnesses. You have the right to your day in court. That isn't functioning that well either these days. The legal system takes years and years to do anything. But nonetheless, you at least have these rights. You have far less rights of that sort against a regulatory agency. For example, the appeal is often to a regulatory court, which is the judge is appointed by the regulatory agency. It's much harder to, or often you can't, go to real court where you actually have some rights.
If I'm charged with a crime, I am presumed innocent with the burden of proof placed on the state to make me guilty. That's sure not true if I'm hauled before the IRS, the EPA, the SEC. How come they don't have to follow that same rule?
Well, because we as voters have not insisted that our Congress make them follow that same rule. Now, there are structures in place, structures that are being increasingly ignored. Regulatory agencies, they're put in place by Congress, and Congress says, we're not going to write the rules on, and it's sensible, we're not going to write the rules on what it takes to get a driver's license. That's up to the Driver's License Bureau. The FAA figures out how many hours of experience you need to get a pilot's license. We're not going to write that in law. But how the FAA is supposed to do that, and it does, is it issues a proposed rule. It's out for public comment. It does a cost-benefit analysis. There's a procedure in place to try to make things reasonable, and then there's a set of appeals. But that is the sort of thing that's vanishing. They make up the rules as they see fit. The rules are more and more vague. They're, you shall not engage in an abusive practice.
Yeah, what's that?
Well, what's an abusive practice? Well, we'll tell you that when we come after you and demand an $8 billion settlement.
There seems to be another layer of enforcement going on in the federal level, which is the criminal statutes that have been multiplying. What role do those criminal statutes play in basically bullying businesses into making settlements when they have a run-in with regulatory agencies rather than demanding their day in court?
Yeah, in the past, regulation was a civil affair, and you could get fined maybe, but not a criminal affair where you could get thrown into jail. And there's more and more, thousands now, of federal criminal statutes. Like there's the story of the poor guy who threw some fish overboard and was then charged for criminal destruction of documents under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And these are criminal, not civil. So the penalties are pretty extraordinary if they come after you. And it's very hard to know what they are or if you've done them. They're enforced very seldom. Maybe I shouldn't admit on the air. We picked up a bone on the beach the other day, which looked good, brought it home, and discovered when we figured out what it was, we had just violated some federal Mammal Protection Act, right. And could be thrown in jail for 10 years if anybody bothered to look at us.
Well, money still seems to be a lubricant for these problems. I once rented a senator. It cost about $20,000. A group of us passed the hat to get him to make a phone call to a regulatory agency just to look at our perfectly lawful application for approval that had been sitting there unread for months. We got our money's worth. Everything was legal. We didn't violate any boundaries on contributions. But what kind of business model is it when I have to lubricate my senator just to get the regulatory agency to work?
Well, now you see, I think, some of the reason why the system is the way it is. In your case, there wasn't even complicated or vague laws that you needed a ruling on. It was simply getting them to do what they're supposed to do in the time they're supposed to do it on a perfectly normal application. I think, though, there's sort of a theory of efficient corruption. If you can just pay the $20,000, it's fine. The worst problem of all is if that senator had said not just that, but, I hear you're running a radio show. You shouldn't be talking to that guy Cochrane, and then we'll see how much better we can. Now, that is, that is, I think, the bigger danger. Now, I want to go on a little bit and answer your previous question in this context. Mm-hmm. There is hope, and I think there are structures that could be put in place. This last November, there was a bunch of bills introduced in Congress to put some limits on these criminal penalties. One was there's a legal doctrine called mens rea, which is to be prosecuted, you have to intend to break the law. Now, many of these regulatory criminal actions, they don't even show that you intended to break some law.
Or were even aware.
Or were even aware of the law. Now, ignorance of the law is no excuse, but of course, ignorance of a horribly complicated code that nobody can figure out what it is a better excuse. But that you can't be prosecuted if you had no intention whatsoever of doing anything. That's a principle that goes back thousands of years that has gotten lost in this regulation. And it's good to see Congress saying, hey, wait a minute, here is a defense. If you picked up a bone of something on the beach that turned out to be a protected marine mammal, guess what? You can't be thrown in jail for that. Similarly, and on your other story, you said you had put in an application perfectly legal and they were just sitting on it. I think we ought to have a habeas corpus for regulatory decisions. If you've got all your paperwork in and you've waited, let's say, 6 months, then you're presumed that they said yes. If they don't come back and say no within 6 months, it's automatically a yes. Something like a statute of limitations on their ability to say no would be a useful right for us to have.
John, we've seen an enormous amount of industry cartelization in the past 10 years, whether it's banking or health insurance or energy. Basically, any field that's heavily regulated has turned into a cartel, usually dominated by a few big players. What are the economic consequences of that?
in my view, pretty bad. So if there's an enormous amount of regulation, first of all, you need to have millions of dollars and lots of employees doing compliance and filling out paperwork. So small new companies just can't do it. And the established big companies kind of like that. That means there's no competition. You also need to have lobbyists going back and forth, and you need to hire ex-regulators to help you fill out the forms with the new regulators. All of that stuff is a way of stopping competition from coming in. But new companies and competition is the lifeblood of economic growth. So we're heading towards many industries with 3, 4, 5 big, very politicized, very staid, uncompetitive, uninnovative companies, all of them with very close relationships to government. Think of banks, think of health insurers. Those are the big ones now. Energy companies may be heading that way as well. And that just that's awful for economic growth, dynamism, jobs, all those wonderful things we want, as well as political freedom. These are clearly companies that are not going to be speaking out against anything, or their employees are not going to be speaking out or anything. The quid pro quo is not just economic, it's also political.
Doesn't regulatory-driven cartelization make it easier for central planners to direct our economy?
It's worse than central planning. There's a certain logic to good old Swedish socialism of the old kind. It's not so much central planning, it's not socialist, it's corporatist might be a good word for it, where we still have supposedly private companies, but if something is done by the government, there's actually some transparency. If the government spends money, then you or I can put in a Freedom of Information Act and find out where the money got spent and find out who bid for it. And it can be corrupt and inefficient and so forth. But if that's all done inside a protected private company that is trading political support to the regulator, it's much harder for us to find out what's going on.
As an ex-venture capitalist, I tend to look at business models when I'm trying to understand an industry. And I definitely noticed that the Attorney General and Department of Justice have made a very lucrative business extracting billions of dollars in settlements from pretty much anyone they choose to go after. Much of this money stays inside the agencies, which gives them an independent source of financing outside of congressional control, and they even disperse money to favored outside groups. Isn't Congress supposed to be in charge of the federal purse?
Yeah, Congress is supposed to be in charge of the purse. And the thing I worry about that even more, since Congress spends money in all sorts of crazy ways, but the demanding of money on a settlement, clearly where we don't go to court, because going to court, we make it even more expensive for you than you go to court. But it's kind of like, it's the old version of taxation where the guy showed up at your door and said, I'll take the pig and the goat. And you say, no, please don't take the goat, take the sheep instead. And then he runs off with it. These settlements where instead of paying money directly to the agency, which is, as you notice, a separate source of funding to the agency, but then they say you can instead give money to the following favored nonprofit groups, which turn out to be groups that also contribute to candidates. So this turns into a political slush fund, and that's where you can see my worry about politicization of this whole regulatory state. We started with sort of this idea of regulations are a good thing. The government will keep companies from doing bad things. And look where we've ended up. Both regulatory agencies and Department of Justice wandering around demanding $8 billion to be sent to their political allies and buddies.
That's another way to do it besides handing out welfare.
Well, handing out welfare is a completely different issue. And not one quite so much about demanding political support.
Well, tell us a story about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and their use of Bayesian improved surname geocoding to shake down auto lenders for $100 million.
Yeah, this was one. So there is worry and there's discrimination, and I'm against discrimination like the next guy. They were worried that auto lenders were charging higher rates to minorities, but auto lenders are not allowed to ask if you're a minority, and the banks who lend to auto lenders are not allowed to ask if you're a minority. So how did they decide that the auto lenders were doing bad stuff? They basically enshrined into law a bad version of an ethnic joke. If your name is Harrison, Washington, or Gonzalez, they looked at your interest rate and decided that auto lenders were lending too much to them and came after them in the usual way. Not we're going to take you to court, but we're going to demand a big settlement. which will then be sent off to our buddies. Now, there's two parts about this that are bad. It's not about discrimination. The part that really gets me about this is, of course, they did not give the banks and the auto lenders the Bayesian improved surname geocoding program ahead of time. There was no way to know, am I okay with the law? They made up that program after the fact. Second, they never even alleged intent to discriminate. They said, well, whatever you did, it had this effect, measured by some computer program that we won't let you see how it works, and so you need to give us money. So, back to mens rea, if you're going to prosecute someone, at least you have to allege intent to discriminate, and you have to show us the rules of the game.
Isn't there any way someone Congress can step up and subject this to some kind of review?
Oh, sure. You could fight the regulator, and Charles Murray has a good suggestion. All of us are guilty of 5 felonies a day, so, very few people actually get prosecuted. He had this idea we should have civil disobedience and all pool in to pay the legal fees of the one guy who's going to go up and fight them in court.
Yeah.
That would help. And yes, it's Congress's job to rein this sort of stuff in, to give us rights, to give us access to courts.
So the FDA controls more than just what drugs we take. I've been following a startup that's been developing something called the Aqua Advantage Salmon, which is basically a GMO salmon that is designed to put on weight quickly and be produced very economically. How long did the regulatory process take to approve that product, and how many innovators can afford to run that kind of gauntlet?
The answer, I think, is close to 20 years, and I'm not even sure that they've approved it yet. This is a great story from my Hoover colleague, Henry Miller, who does a lot of following what's going on at the FDA. Yeah, it took the FDA actually a whole decade just to decide how they would regulate the new salmon. And so they decided in the end to regulate it as a veterinary drug so that the poor people in charge had to show the same kind of safety and efficacy as a drug. I mean, the big story here is the FDA, like the EPA, if you put in the words genetically modified, all of a sudden science goes out the window. The science says genetically modified stuff is fine, but, it's very politically sensitive. So the answer is pretty much just to sit on anything that says genetically modified, and that's what happened to the poor Aqua Advantage salmon people.
So they just have to keep banging the drum long enough to get some action out of them.
What happened in this case is that if they just sit on it long enough, you run out of your ability to run a company. I mean, I've seen that happen with quite a few other companies. It just sits there under review. Well, we want you to do another clinical trial. We want you to do another something else. And then, eventually you run out of money, and that's the end of that. And there's the products that don't happen because they just sat there.
This is the famous Bastiat's unseen. We actually don't get to see all the economic activity that could have happened had it not been for the regulations.
Exactly.
You've called for a Magna Carta, a new Magna Carta for the regulatory state. What is that?
The answer to this, one answer to this is that we need more rights to challenge the regulators when they do stuff like this. As I mentioned, a time limit. If I've put in my request and it's filled all the rules, you have to rule on it within 6 months. I think I need the right to see the evidence against me so that the Bayesian improved the geocoding program. You can't
hide the ball,
bring a criminal prosecution unless you have made that program public, and I have had a chance to run my customers against your program and see if I'm violating the law. We don't have secret laws. That's certainly something that is enshrined in actual legislation and ought to be enshrined in regulatory legislation. So Magna Carta is 1,000 years old, but the same sort of protections and rule of law that we sort of have in real law, we ought to have in regulatory law as well.
So much of this is obscure to the everyday man on the street. I mean, if you're involved in a particular business, you hear particular horror stories about particular agencies, but it seems to be very difficult to make this an issue that appeals to large groups of people. What can politicians do who care about this to elevate this story?
Well, I think it's very helpful to keep repeating all these stories. It's unfortunate, as you said, the business is not seen. We don't have good numbers on how much economic damage this has caused, other than noticing that our economy is kind of stuck in the water and everybody's arguing why. I think the answer is you and me and your radio listeners get outraged and write to our congressman, and this becomes an issue. Our politicians follow what people ask of them. And when people are mad about this stuff, our politicians will do something. But as they are, the package of laws introduced last November in the House is a reaction to this sort of thing.
Well, John, you keep writing and speaking about this. I'll keep following your blog, The Grumpy Economist, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
That was the grumpy economist, John Cochrane from the Hoover Institution, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, please sign up for updates on realclearradio.org. And if you'd like to hear more programs like this, please hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. That wraps up our show for this week. You have a safe and happy New Year's, and please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.